The main presentation is a great friend of ours, Claire Mason. Claire runs a wonderful PR firm that's based down in Brighton on the south coast, 55 minutes from central London, and by goodness are we not envious of you most days. It's called Man Bites Dog. Claire founded it several years ago because a news story can tell you facts, and it's undoubtedly true that often dogs bite men. But it's pretty rare that a man would bite a dog. Although my Uncle Peter was famous for having bitten the cat once, which really taught the cat a lesson, but that's a Boulding family story, which we could cover later, Claire. What we love about Claire is that you can ask her to talk about a subject that has been done to death, honestly. You know, diversity and inclusion, gender equality. We know we should be working towards it better. We've got probably some things in place, but how many times do we hear the same old stuff? Claire looked at it from a new perspective, as we would hope from the founder of Man Bites Dog. Claire Mason, please tell us.
Thank you, Julian. I'll have to hear this story about a man bites cat a bit later. Thank you very much. Did you know that for the last decade, women have outnumbered men in high-status professions? Across the world, women are going to university in record numbers. And today, there are more university-educated women in the workforce than there are men. But there's a problem. We're still lagging behind in pay and in power. And this divide is a symptom of a much bigger issue, and an issue that all of you have the power to do something about. That issue is the gender say gap. The gender say gap is a term I coined to highlight the invisibility of women and diverse groups as expert authorities in business and in public life. Women are disproportionately the experts in the room. We're more likely to work in a high-status profession. We're more likely to have a second degree. And yet we're not hearing from female authorities. Everywhere we look, the women are missing. We're missing from the newsroom, where we write and feature in just a small proportion of the news, from the boardroom, where we are still so far from gender equality, and in the creative industries, we are still missing from the creative director's chair. And when we audit the gender say gap, when we look at the use of expert commentators in the media and in conferences, women are remarkably still outnumbered 4-to-1 in conferences and up to 5-to-1 as expert commentators in the media, despite us being disproportionately expert. Now, COVID-19, as we know, and we're in just the right place to talk about it. Fortunately, I don't have to talk about it medically today, but it's a crisis in public health, and health is obviously a sector where women and professionals from a Black and minority ethnic background have succeeded, and indeed are overrepresented, even at senior levels. So you would expect that given that COVID-19 was a health crisis, we might have heard from a diversity of experts. But sadly, that wasn't the case. What we saw was journalists, again and again, turning to white men as figures of scientific and social authority. They would fall into a pattern of interviewing men about the strategy and the policy, the high-level piece, and then women and Black and minority ethnic people, either as frontline workers or as service users on the practical implications. So we're just not seeing leaders from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds or women being interviewed as these expert spokespeople. But we can't simply blame the media for this. As organisations, so that's us as agencies and our clients, we need to forward a diversity of experts to commentate on every subject under the sun. And if we don't, there are consequences. So, for example, City University runs a fantastic project called the Expert Women Project, and they count every single interview and who does it across the news every year. And what they found was a key driver of the say inequality that I'm talking about is the experts that we choose to represent us, the people that we put forward as spokespeople. So to give an example, Journalists, particularly The Guardian, complained vociferously last year that for 6 entire months in the run-up to December last year, we had 6 months of COVID briefings entirely and exclusively fronted by men. This led to a news agenda that was 5-to-1 male experts to female experts. But what was even more damaging was that it normalised the lack of women in authority and the lack of women being seen as experts. And not hearing from female and diverse experts means we're only hearing half the story. And it also means that at a time when we're talking so much about how we want to attract women and we want to attract diverse talent into sectors where we're underrepresented, like science, like technology, that we're missing a huge opportunity to shine a brighter spotlight on those role models. So for some years now, my team at Man Bites Dog has been on a mission to increase the representation of female and diverse experts so that we can close this gender say gap. And for our campaign this year, we wanted to look at the other side of the representation agenda, the media. So I'm delighted to be able to share with you today the results of our campaign, for which we teamed up with Women in Journalism to investigate the state of gender diversity in the UK media. This study has been 6 months in the making. We have personally interviewed 1,200 UK journalists, and we asked them what they thought about the state of gender diversity in the media and its impact on women in journalism, its impact on the media, and more broadly, what's its impact on society. So what is the gender news gap? Well, put quite simply, it's this lack of gender diversity in UK media. And probably naively, I was expecting that this would get better. I was expecting that we would see some fantastic progress. But actually what we found was a really stubbornly persistent gender news gap. And that we're a very long way from gender balance in UK media. Our research reveals that fewer than 1 in 5 female journalists believe there is adequate gender diversity in UK journalism. And less than a quarter of UK journalists, male and female, rate gender diversity in the media as good or excellent. This is a crazy state of affairs. Our research reveals some of the greatest challenges facing women in journalism right now. Access to the profession is a challenge. Nearly half of UK journalists, male and female, believe it's harder for women to access the profession than men. And when you start asking them about ethnic minorities, the picture is even worse. Access is a huge challenge. But what's an even bigger challenge is career progression. Nearly 3/4 of UK journalists, male and female, think that career progression in journalism is more difficult for women than for men. Now, there is a sort of unholy cocktail of causes behind the stalling of women's careers, the greatest of which is leadership and culture. Tone from the top is key. 70% of female journalists complain that the most senior roles remain dominated by men. Nearly 3/4 of UK journalists, male and female, call out a culture which they describe as macho and intimidating. That really isn't serving the profession. And what this is causing is what we're calling a glass newsroom that is excluding women from high-status journalism specialisms like hard news, politics, business and finance, which is perpetuating the lack of women in these areas. And like a pane of glass on this glass newsroom, what's happening is that this is invisible, seemingly, to their male colleagues. Almost every woman we interviewed had experienced some form of gender discrimination. Many had experienced age discrimination. Many of them had also experienced discrimination based on class and based on their ethnic background as well. But the male journalists are just not seeing it as much of a problem as the women do. So I think raising awareness of this is really important. But ultimately, why does this gender news gap matter, and why should it matter to all of you? Well, equality in journalism is a critical foundation of a more equal society. The overwhelming majority of UK journalists believe that diversity in journalism is really important. They believe that the media has a duty to reflect the diversity of the society it serves. They believe that we need a diversity of journalists to be relevant to our readers, so it's good business. And they believe that a balance between male and female journalists is necessary to properly reflect key societal issues. And for me, it's that representation piece that is the really critical issue. The gender news gap directly impacts how women and diverse communities are represented, how our experiences and concerns are reflected, and how we make our voices heard to campaign for change. Our research shows that the gender news gap is directly contributing to the gender say gap I talked about earlier, this lack of female and diverse expert contributors consulted by the media. According to our research, more than 4 in 5 women in journalism believe that female journalists and female expert contributors highlight underrepresented issues. Public opinion and policy are shaped by the people who decide what's the news we choose, what is the news, whose story should we tell, and who gets to tell them. And if we don't hear from women and diverse groups as journalists and expert authorities, we're only hearing part of the story. And this lack of say equality is creating huge gaps in information, representation and policy, which means that really important issues can go unspoken for decades. Recent movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter and Reclaim These Streets are surfacing these issues. But these are issues that have been underrepresented in mainstream media and politics, perhaps because the people whose stories we tell and the people who we choose to tell them aren't being allowed to speak. So increasing the diversity of editors and journalists and changing culture is going to be key to surfacing these issues to create change. But sadly, we're seeing a real lack of action in this area. Less than a quarter of media directors participating in our survey measure the ethnic diversity of their workforce or the gender diversity of their workforce. And similarly, less than a third of the journalists we spoke to worked in organisations that had targets to measure and change the diversity of their expert spokespeople. So we are asking media organisations, men and women in journalism, to recognise this gender news gap and take action to make journalism the inclusive profession that our society deserves. But that, of course, is just one half of the gender say gap equation. The other half is us. As agency leaders in marketing, communications, advertising and media, we're all in the representation business, and we can all do our bit for say equality. We need to think really carefully about who we're putting forward as expert spokespeople, who we're elevating as thought leaders, and how we represent people in our content and in our advertising. So I would like to ask you all today to start measuring the diversity of representation. Audit your clients' say equality. Does it reflect the diversity of their workforce? Does it reflect the diversity of their customer base? And the workforce and customer base they're seeking to inspire and attract in the future. Set bold goals for your clients to increase their say equality and build a diverse talent pipeline. If you haven't got the spokespeople and the leaders yet, look to the next generation and start building their confidence and building their skills to be speakers. And if the women are missing in the places you need them, look elsewhere. It might be that you can find the women in marketing or the women in HR. Let's elevate them instead and get them talking to inspire the next generation. And finally, use your influence as sponsors, speakers, and advertisers to create change. You can find the full details of our research on our website, or please do link in with me and I'd be delighted to tell you more about it. And with your support together, I'm really confident that we can close the gender say gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. I mean, that makes you think. We just have to do something about this. You know, we've come back to the pandemic, back to the government briefings, and who have we got the same people again. We've got Boris, we've got Chris Whitty, and we've got Patrick Vallance. We've made no progress at all. We have to do something about this, folks. Well said, Claire. I mean, please, I hope everybody will follow you and find out with some of those suggestions about how to make this happen. It'd be really cool.